A black woman walked into the gleaming glass conference room. She wore a beige blazer with understated elegance, her hair neatly tied back her face, bearing only a touch of makeup, but unmistakable was the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to power. She calmly extended her hand across the conference table. The man across from her, Dean Whitmore, CEO of the tech conglomerate Veritin, looked at that hand with undisguised disdain and indifference. "I don't shake hands with employees," Dean said, casting a glance at his colleagues behind him who smirked knowingly. "Looks like the room just got a few degrees colder." The woman Leona Carter slowly withdrew her hand without a flicker of emotion. "I'm not an employee," she replied quietly but clearly. Dean chuckled, turning to the all-male executive team seated beside him. "Then what are you doing in my building?" Leona didn't respond immediately. She opened her leather briefcase, pulled out a slim file, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm deciding whether or not to withdraw my $2 billion investment." The words weren't loud, but the room froze. Dean stopped laughing. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes. The assistants on either side shifted nervously, and the security guards at the door, who had seemed like mere decorum, suddenly stood upright. In silence, the balance of power had shifted. Before Leona Carter set foot inside Veritin's headquarters that morning, she already knew what to expect. She didn't arrive in her usual luxury car, but drove an old, modest sedan, presentable yet deliberately inconspicuous. She wore neutral conservative clothing with no markers of status, except for a steel-plated wristwatch her father once wore when starting his first company. This wasn't humility, it was a test. Her mission today wasn't just to evaluate Veritin's AI technology. It was to assess something that no quarterly report could reflect, but every employee had to live with daily the cultural climate inside. At the front desk, a young receptionist named Chloe offered a textbook customer service smile. That is, until her eyes met Leona's brown skin. The smile faltered for a split second, too brief to reprimand, but long enough for a keen eye to catch. "Here to apply for an admin position?" Chloe asked, tone tinged with uncertainty. "HR is on the 3rd floor. I have a 10 a.m. appointment with Mr. Dean Whitmore. My name is Leona Carter." Chloe checked the system. Suspicion lingered in her voice. "Oh. Please wait in the right-hand area. Not the VIP lounge with plush chairs and artisan coffee, but a narrow corner near the emergency stairs." Leona didn't object. She sat on the cold wooden bench, opened her notebook, and observed. Most who walked past primarily white men gave her a quick glance, some visibly unsure how to place her. She knew this feeling. 20 years, and it never really went away. 45 minutes passed. No apology. No courtesy beverage. No explanation for the delay. When Dean's assistant finally arrived, he didn't escort Leona to the 22nd floor executive boardroom with skyline views and sleek leather chairs. Instead, she was led to a small, windowless meeting room with a scuffed wooden table and 3 mismatched folding chairs. Dean Whitmore was already inside, hunched over his phone. He waved dismissively without lifting his head. "Take a seat. We'll begin shortly." 3 other men sat around the table, gray-haired, suited with eyes that flicked over Leona like an outdated resume, uninterested, unimpressed. One man yawned, another checked his watch. Leona crossed her legs and remained silent. She had seen those looks before, heard those yawns in countless boardrooms. They weren't surprising. They were merely data points. At last, Dean set down his phone and glanced at her for the first time like someone skimming a cover letter they'd already decided to reject. "You're here about the diversity initiative stuff, right?" he asked, his tone thick with condescension. No, I'm here to discuss a potential investment opportunity, Leona replied evenly. Not defensive, not submissive, just clear. Dean arched an eyebrow, suppressing a smirk. An investment? He said the word as if it were a punchline. But Leona didn't blink. Instead, she opened her leather folder. Inside was not just capital but a mirror, a test of whether this company judged potential by innovation or pigmentation. Dean clicked a remote. A screen lit up with a presentation, cartoonish graphics, oversimplified charts and buzzwords, explained like an elementary school tutorial. We're developing a cutting-edge AI solution for enterprise clients. Dean began slowly, as if speaking to a child. I'll walk you through what an algorithm is just so it's easier to follow. He smiled smugly. Two of the men exchanged a chuckle low enough to be deniable, loud enough to be heard. Leona leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on the screen. Just as Dean inhaled to continue, she spoke. Calm, crisp, controlled. Your overview mentions proprietary deep learning architecture. Can you explain how it differentiates from traditional transformer models, especially regarding inference latency at scale? Dean stalled. His eyes flicked toward his assistant. The presenter fumbled to change slides. That's more of a technical point. Our CTO could get into that if needed. Leona nodded once, then turned the page in her folder. I also noticed your Q2 R&D spending dropped 22% from last quarter, despite reports of ongoing research expansion. Has that discrepancy been reconciled internally? The room fell silent. Laughter disappeared. Posture shifted. Dean clicked frantically through slides, skipping financials. His smile tightened. I think we should focus on more relevant topics, like the company's diversity initiatives. Leona sat back. She understood perfectly. They weren't dismissing her because she lacked understanding. On the contrary, she understood more than they were comfortable admitting, and that to them was the real threat. But she wasn't here to seek comfort. She was here to hold a mirror, and Veritin had just seen its reflection. Dean cleared his throat and signaled his assistant. Let's take 5. Devin, have Melissa bring in some coffee. He turned to Leona with a performative smile, the kind men wear when they feel control slipping, but still want to look composed. How do you take it? Lots of cream and sugar, I imagine. The words fell lightly, but the weight was unmistakable. Microaggression veiled stereotyping, and a tinge of racial condescension dressed up in politeness. It wasn't new, but in this moment it was loud. One executive smirked. Another pretended not to hear. A third nodded ever so slightly approval, hidden in indifference. Leona didn't flinch. She didn't glare. She simply closed her folder, the soft sound of leather snapping shut, echoing louder than any retort. Before we continue, I'd like to see Veritin's internal diversity retention metrics, she said clearly. Dean's jaw tightened. He had not expected that, especially not from her. The room shifted. A new player entered, Marcus Fields, Director of Diversity Compliance, and the only non-white senior manager in the building. Marcus spoke in practiced cadence, his voice almost too smooth. We've increased minority hiring by at least 8% annually. We're committed to building an inclusive environment. Leona didn't blink. And the retention rate. Marcus hesitated. Dean jumped in. We're evolving Ms. Carter. Rome wasn't built in a day. But Leona knew better. This Rome wasn't being built, it was being protected. Behind numbers and niceties, it was still the same old fortress. And she had just begun to chip at its foundation, not with noise, but with calm precision that made the entire market tremble, even if they didn't know it yet. The meeting wasn't over, but the tension felt like a thunderstorm had passed without a single word raised. Dean leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie and checking his watch, like a man trying to reclaim composure already slipping through the cracks. The door opened. 5 men entered, all in dark suits, hair salt and pepper, laughing with the casual ease of men who had just come from a golf course or private lounge. Dean rose quickly, eager now. "Gentlemen, welcome. Please make yourselves comfortable." Remember that Friday mixer at the club? Laughter filled the air. Coffee was poured and re-poured, and for nearly 3 minutes no one acknowledged Leona. At last Dean turned as though remembering she was still in the room. "Gentlemen, this is Olivia, Leona." He didn't bother correcting the name mix-up. "She's here to share some ideas on inclusion. Not Miss Carter, not the investor, just Leona. A first name stripped of title, a role stripped of respect." A few nods followed. 2 avoided eye contact altogether. 1, James Turner, according to his nameplate, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered just loud enough, "Quota seat. Just nod and smile." Leona heard. She didn't react, but she marked it a small stroke of her pen against the edge of her notes. Dean turned again, half joking. "Maybe share one of those inspiring stories of yours. I'm sure the guys would love to hear about your journey." The implication was clear. She wasn't here for what she knew she was here to be. Their box checked. But Leona didn't share a personal story. She began outlining current AI sector trends and Q2 volatility. Dean cut in almost immediately. No, we already know all that. We meant your perspective as..." He trailed off. But the unfinished sentence said everything as a black woman, as someone who didn't belong. And just then the door opened once more. A white man entered, crisp suit, silver hair combed back, radiating boardroom authority. Dean sprang forward like a man receiving rescue. "Alan." "Thank God you made it." They shook hands, gripped shoulders, laughed. Then Dean turned back toward Leona, relaxed now, voice smug. "I don't shake hands with staff." Silence fell. Something shifted. And Leona, she didn't flinch, didn't speak. She simply looked him in the eye, not from above, not from below, but with a calm that silenced even those who thought they were above reproach. Then she reached for her phone and typed a single word. "Execute." Across the city, in a sleek law office with frosted glass walls and humming air conditioning, a paralegal's phone buzzed. Then another. And another. Simultaneously, 6 different legal teams opened an identical email. Subject line: Initiate Phase 2. Carter Protocol. Attached a dossier, time-stamped, documented, and ready. Inside the Veriton boardroom, nothing had changed on the surface. Men still sipped their espresso. Dean still leaned back, smug and unaware. Leona sat with her legs crossed, face calm, expression unreadable. But in less than 4 minutes, the shockwaves began. Dean's smartwatch buzzed first. He looked down, frowned. Then his phone rang, his assistant's number. He ignored it. Seconds later, Marcus Fields, the token diversity officer, was called out of the room. He returned pale, whispering something in Dean's ear that made the color drain from his face. "Excuse me," Dean muttered, fumbling with his phone now. His email loaded with headlines he wasn't prepared for. Breaking Carter Holdings, reevaluates multi-billion-dollar stake in Veriton over internal discrimination allegations. Leaked meeting notes. Suggest racial bias at executive level, not staff. Investors' silent exit sparks industry backlash. Every media outlet from tech blogs to major news stations had received a perfectly worded tip. Not slander, just facts. just receipts. James Turner's phone fell from his hand. Leona didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The message had arrived louder than any voice could carry. The woman they had tried to belittle was the reason their company would now face the market's full judgment, and for the first time that day, no one was laughing. By the time Leona exited the Veritan building, the world outside had already changed. News vans lined the sidewalks. Reporters shouted questions from behind barricades. "Ms. Carter, is it true you're pulling all your funding? Will Veritan survive this? Did Dean Whitmore really refuse to shake your hand?" Leona didn't pause. She didn't need to grandstand. Her silence was her strategy, and now her silence echoed louder than any press conference ever could. Behind her inside Veritan's glass fortress, panic took root. The board convened an emergency meeting. PR executives scrambled to issue statements. Lawyers drafted non-disclosure addendums in a hurry, while HR prepared talking points to defend against the narrative unraveling like wildfire. But it was too late. Screens across the country from Bloomberg terminals to TikTok timelines looped the same image. A still frame of Leona Carter calmly seated in a boardroom surrounded by suits. The caption, "The only person who didn't need to raise her voice to shut down the room." That night, tech forums erupted. Carter. Protocol trended #1. Women reposted. Investors commented. Black founders called her a symbol. And quietly, companies across the industry began revisiting their own meeting rooms and the way they looked at diversity. Not because they cared, but because now they were afraid. Afraid that the next Leona Carter wasn't coming with a protest sign. She was coming with a portfolio and the power to walk out. It was 6:03 a.m. when Dean Whitmore's phone rang. He hadn't slept. Not really. Not since the Carter meeting, if one could even call it that. More like a slow, precise detonation disguised as a polite conversation. The name flashing on the screen made his gut tighten. Malcolm Dresner, Global Strategy Board. He hesitated, just for a second, then picked up. Dean came the clipped British voice on the other end. Calm, unhurried, dangerous. "Walk with me." Dean rose from his leather chair instinctively like a schoolboy called to the headmaster's office. The call was still connected. Dresner didn't repeat himself. He never did. "You embarrassed us," he said simply. "You embarrassed the fund." Dean swallowed. It was taken out of context. She, Malcolm interrupted. "You mean the woman whose fund controls a larger AI portfolio than every man in that boardroom combined? The one whose questions your CTO couldn't answer? The one whose name you didn't bother learning?" Dean said nothing. "You've made Veritan vulnerable. Not just to investors, to regulators, to scrutiny. And the worst part?" Malcolm sighed almost softly. "You didn't even see it happening." There was a pause. Then the words Dean feared most. "We're initiating a review." Dean's spine stiffened. "A review." Malcolm's tone dropped. "Effective immediately. Operations leadership and culture. Everything will be on the table." Another pause. "And Dean, yes, if Ms. Carter ever walks into one of our buildings again, you don't shake her hand." Dean blinked. "You stand." The line went dead, and just like that, the man who once dismissed a handshake now stood alone waiting for one that would never come. 2 weeks later, the lobby of Veritan's glass tower looked different. Not because the marble had changed or the suits were any more polite, but because the silence now held something sharper than before. Tension laced the air like a held breath. Leona Carter stepped through the revolving doors once more, but this time the receptionist Chloe stood up straight before Leona even reached the desk. "Ms. Carter." "Welcome back," she said quickly, voice crisp, smile intact. "Mr. Dresner is waiting upstairs. No assumptions, no dismissive glances, no directions to a side lounge." Leona simply nodded, walking past her heels, clicking not loudly but with authority no one dared underestimate now. On the 22nd floor, the glass-walled boardroom was already occupied. But this time, Leona didn't walk in as an investor seeking data. She walked in as the decision-maker. Malcolm Dresner shook her hand first, and motioned her to the head of the table. Dean Whitmore, seated further down, didn't meet her eyes. "Let's begin," Leona said, placing her folder down. But this time, it wasn't filled with due diligence or quarterly forecasts. It was a restructuring plan. Comprehensive, strategic, cultural. It outlined a partnership, but only under non-negotiable terms: accountability, inclusive governance, and a full audit of Veriton's leadership culture. One of the directors shifted in his seat. "You mean to say we must replace half our board?" Leona turned to him. "No. I mean to say, you already have." And then she looked to Dean. "You once said you don't shake hands with employees. That's fine. From now on, you won't need to." She slid a final document across the table. Dean opened it. At the top, "Notice of resignation." Already signed. By him. The boardroom went still. Malcolm simply leaned back and said, "Motion carried." And as Leona folded her hands calmly, the city skyline behind her, it was clear she hadn't come to break the system. She had come to rewrite who it answered to. Veriton didn't fall. It didn't crash or burn or make the headlines for scandal that would have been too easy. What happened was quieter, more deliberate. The kind of transformation that didn't come with applause, but with held breath and shifted gazes. The first thing to go wasn't Dean Whitmore's nameplate. It was the plaque near the elevator listing all-white, all-male leadership. By the following month, that plaque was replaced with a digital directory, one that for the first time included names like Aisha Monroe, CTO, and Luis Ortega, head of people and culture. And Leona. She didn't take a permanent seat on the board. She declined it. Instead, she appointed a governance council, a rotating panel of experts across tech ethics, education, and civil rights. People who had been ignored, passed over, or not quite the right fit for decades. At the next shareholder conference, Leona stood at the center of the room, not as a guest, but as the woman who had redrawn the lines of power. "I didn't come here to be let in," she said into the mic. "I came to make sure no one has to beg for entry again." Some clapped. Some didn't know if they were allowed to, and a few mostly young staffers near the back stood silently with eyes wide and filled with something that wasn't awe but recognition. Because what Leona had done wasn't just about one boardroom or one tech company. She had exposed a structure that thrived on polished exclusion and rebranded it with something far more enduring: accountability, transparency, truth. She didn't tear down the glass ceiling. She rendered it visible, then made sure it had hinges and a lock from the inside that no longer worked. It wasn't the headlines that wrote Leona's story, it was the footnotes. The quiet policy changes buried deep in board memos, the new faces showing up on hiring panels, the anonymous feedback forms that finally received responses, and the slow, undeniable shift in hallway conversations from exclusion, cloaked in civility, to inclusion enforced by accountability. One rainy afternoon, Leona walked out of the Veritan building for the last time, not as a retreat, but as completion. The security guard at the front, a young black woman named Dana, paused her usual greeting. Her voice wavered just slightly as she said, "Miss Carter, thank you for everything." Leona smiled gently. "Don't thank me. Just make sure you hold that door for the next one." She didn't mean physically, and Dana understood. 3 blocks away at a community tech hub funded by a quiet donation from an anonymous source, a group of high school girls, Black, Latina, Southeast Asian, coded their first AI simulation. On the wall behind them hung a simple quote: "You were never too much. They were just too small." Elsie. In another office, a young executive glanced at her nameplate before her first board presentation. She wore no designer suit, no legacy surname, but she carried a folder marked "Confidential" and an old watch one that had once ticked on the wrist of a woman who refused to be underestimated. Change didn't come in waves. It came in seeds, and Leona Carter had scattered them where no spotlight could reach, but where roots could grow. Because legacies are not built in noise. They're built in motion and in the silence that follows when the world quietly starts moving differently because one woman refused to wait for permission.